The day Inez Turner shot the hat clean off the head of the most eligible bachelor in Dusty Creek, Texas, was the day every mother in the county quietly removed her name from the list of acceptable brides. It was the spring of 1882, and the town of Dusty Creek sat stubborn and sun-baked along the edge of the Edwards Plateau, a place where the wind blew hot from the south and the mesquite trees grew in twisted shapes, as if the land itself had wrestled with something and lost. The town had a general store, a livery, a church with a leaning steeple, 2 saloons, a telegraph office, and more opinions about how a woman ought to conduct herself than it had sense to keep quiet about those opinions. Inez was 24 years old, 5 feet and 7 inches tall, with dark chestnut hair that she kept in a braid most days, because she had no patience for the elaborate curls the other women pinned to their heads before church. Her eyes were the color of creek water when the light caught it just right, green shading to brown at the edges, sharp and clear, and always watching. She had her mother's cheekbones and her father's stubbornness, which was a combination that had never once made anything easy for her. Her father, Thomas Turner, had been a cattle rancher of modest success before a bad winter in 1878 took most of the herd and broke something fundamental in his chest. He passed in the early spring of 1879, leaving Inez and her older brother Marcus with the ranch, the debt, and each other. Marcus had done his best for 2 years before a fever took him on a gray November morning in 1881, and after that, Inez had been alone on a property that was still half-mortgaged. Alone with 20 head of cattle, a cantankerous mule named Fletcher, and a reputation for saying exactly what she thought in a town that had decided women ought to think more quietly. The incident with the hat had come about because Randall Hogg, the banker's son and would-be suitor of every unmarried woman between 17 and 30 in Dusty Creek, had cornered her behind the feed store and told her that the ranch would never survive without a man running it, and that she might as well sell it and marry him before she ran it further into the ground. He had said it with the comfortable certainty of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered to him. Inez had looked at him for a long moment, then she had stepped back, drawn the Colt revolver she carried on her hip, and shot the hat off his head with a single clean pull of the trigger. She had not aimed for his head, she had aimed for the hat. There was a difference that Randall Hogg had refused to appreciate. Word spread the way it always did in small towns, fast and colorful, and with a few extra details added for flavor. By suppertime, half the county knew that Inez Turner had shot at a man for proposing to her. By the following Sunday, the other half had heard it was 2 men. Her reputation, already singed at the edges from years of working cattle alongside the hired hands and refusing to apologize for knowing how to do it, caught fully on fire and burned to something new. The women who had once invited her to quilting circles stopped inviting her. The mothers who had considered her a possible match for their sons reconsidered with vigor. The men who might have courted her thought twice, then 3 times, then found reasons to be busy on the other side of the county. Inez told herself she did not care. She told herself this every morning while she hitched Fletcher to the wagon and drove out to check the fence line. She told herself this while she negotiated with the cattle buyer in Careville, who always tried to underprice her, because he assumed she did not know what her animals were worth. She told herself this while she sat on her porch in the evenings and watched the sun go down behind the hills and felt the silence press against her like something with weight to it. She was fine, she told herself. She was always fine. It was on a Tuesday in late April that Paul Hunter rode into Dusty Creek for the first time. He came from the northwest, following the old cattle trail that ran along the ridge before it dropped down into the valley where the town sat. He was riding a big red roan gelding with a white blaze on its face, and he sat the horse the way men sit horses when they have spent most of their lives in the saddle, not fighting it, not showing off, just easy and settled as if the horse was an extension of his own balance. He was 30 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that had gone a little long at the back of his neck and a jaw that had not seen a razor in 4 or 5 days. His eyes were dark gray, the color of rain clouds when the storm is still deciding what to do about itself. He had grown up in New Mexico territory, the son of a ranch foreman who had taught him that the land gave you exactly what you put into it and not one thing more. He had spent his 20s working cattle drives up through Texas, learning the country, saving his money, and looking for a piece of ground that he could call his own in a way that meant something. He had heard from a man in San Antonio that the country around Dusty Creek was decent grazing land, and that some of the smaller ranches along the plateau were struggling, which sometimes meant opportunity if you approached it right. He had not come to Dusty Creek looking for a wife. He had come looking for land. He rode to the livery first, as any sensible man did, and while the stable boy watered the roan, Paul walked across the main street to the general store to resupply. He bought coffee and dried beans and a box of ammunition for the Winchester he kept in his saddle scabbard, and he asked the woman behind the counter, who was stout and cheerful and named Mrs. Addie Briggs, whether there was anyone in the area with grazing land for sale or lease. Mrs. Briggs tilted her head and considered him with the frank assessment of a woman who had watched men come through her store for 20 years. "Well," she said, "there's the Turner place, east of here about 4 miles. Good land, good water. Girl's been running it alone since her brother passed. She's got more land than cattle right now and more debt than she'd like anyone to know about." "What's the girl's name?" Paul asked. "Inez Turner." Mrs. Briggs paused and something moved in her expression, a kind of fond exasperation. "She's a capable young woman, she is. But she's what you might call difficult. Not difficult like lazy or dishonest. Difficult like she has an opinion about everything and she doesn't see why she ought to keep it to herself." "That doesn't sound like a problem to me," Paul said. Mrs. Briggs looked at him with slightly increased interest. "She also shot a man's hat off his head last month for suggesting she couldn't run a ranch." Paul considered this for a moment. Was she right? About what? About being able to run it. Mrs. Briggs broke into a wide smile. She absolutely was. Paul paid for his supplies, thanked her, and asked directions to the Turner Ranch. He found the place without much difficulty. The road east out of Dusty Creek was a wagon track that ran through scrub oak and cedar, before opening out onto higher ground where the grass grew better, and the sky seemed wider. The Turner Ranch was visible from a quarter-mile out, a main house of weathered plank siding with a broad porch, a barn that had been patched recently and efficiently, a chicken coop, and a series of fenced pastures where a modest number of cattle grazed in the late afternoon heat. He rode up to the front gate and stopped. Inez was on the porch. She had been mending a bridle, and she watched him come up the road with her hands still and her eyes level. She wore work trousers and a faded blue shirt, her hair in its braid over one shoulder, and she had a revolver on her hip in a worn leather holster. She did not stand up. She did not smile. She watched him the way a person watches a weather system that has not yet declared its intentions. "Afternoon," Paul said, pulling the roan to a stop at the gate. "Afternoon," Inez said. "My name's Paul Hunter. I'm looking to speak with whoever owns this property." "You're looking at her." He had been told she was difficult. He registered now that difficult had been the wrong word entirely. She was watchful. She was measured. She was somebody who had been disappointed enough times to be careful about what she let herself expect from a stranger. "I heard you might have some land available," he said. "I'm looking to lease grazing rights on good ground, maybe partner with someone who needs additional cattle to make the numbers work better. I've got money and I've got a herd, about 60 head, coming up from San Antonio with a hired man by the end of the week. I need somewhere to range them." Inez looked at him for a long, unhurried moment. "Get down off that horse," she said finally. "We can talk." He dismounted, tied the roan to the gate post, and came up the porch steps. She did not offer her hand. She gestured to the other chair, a straight-backed wooden thing beside hers, and he sat in it and took off his hat. "I've got about 300 acres of decent grazing north of the main pasture," she said. "Good grass this year, good water from a spring-fed creek that runs along the eastern edge. I'm not selling it. I'm willing to discuss a lease arrangement that benefits both parties." "What would you consider fair?" he asked. She named a figure that was slightly high but not outrageous, and he recognized immediately that she knew what she was talking about. She had calculated the value of the land and the water access and the convenience of having existing infrastructure nearby, and she had priced it accordingly. "That's fair," he said, without trying to bargain her down. She blinked. Just slightly, but he caught it. She had expected him to negotiate. She had a counter-argument ready, and it was not needed, which seemed to momentarily disorganize her. "I'd also ask," Paul continued, "that any arrangement we make is written down and signed. I like clear agreements." "So do I," Inez said. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but something like the beginning of respect. They spent another hour on the porch talking through the details. The sun moved lower in the sky, and the light turned golden and long and soft. The kind of light that makes the hill country look like something from a painting, rather than a working piece of difficult terrain. Inez knew her land in granular detail, the places where the soil went thin and rocky, the places where the grass came in lush after rain, the location of every water source. Paul asked good questions and listened carefully to the answers, and neither of them said anything that was not true. Before he left, she told him he could stable his horse in her barn overnight since the livery in town charged too much for what it offered. It was, he understood, a practical offer, not a personal one. He accepted it in the same spirit. He took the room above the feed store in town, which rented for 50 cents a week and came with a cot, a wash basin, and a window that rattled in the wind. He lay on the cot that first night and thought about the grazing land and the spring-fed creek, and the way Inez Turner had looked at him across the porch, as if she was solving a problem she had not decided was worth solving yet. The paperwork for the lease was drawn up at the office of the local land agent 3 days later, signed by both parties in the presence of a witness, and sealed with the particular formality that legal documents carried in 1882 Texas. It was a 1-year lease with an option to renew, covering the northern 300 acres of the Turner property at a rate that left Inez with enough to make a meaningful payment against her mortgage, and left Paul with enough land to run his herd comfortably. His cattle arrived on Friday, driven up by a weathered old cowhand named Deke Salter, who had worked for Paul for 3 years, and who accepted Paul's instruction to treat the Turner property with the same respect he would his own without needing to be told twice. Deke was 62 years old, missing the top joint of his left index finger from a roping accident he had never properly explained, and he had an uncanny ability to read cattle and horses that Paul had never encountered in anyone else. Inez watched the herd come in from the gate, counting heads with the practiced eye of someone who has done it thousands of times. "Good animals," she said. "Thank you," Paul said. "The brindle one in the middle there is going to try to push through the fence line on the eastern edge. There's a spot the cedar post is weak. You'll want to reinforce it before you settle them." Paul looked at the brindle steer she had indicated, then looked back at her. "How can you tell that from here?" "Because that is exactly what my brother's bull used to do, and they have the same look in their eye," she said. "Restless and stubborn and convinced the grass is better on the other side of whatever is in front of them." Paul laughed. It came out genuine and unguarded, and Inez looked briefly startled by it, as if laughter had not been what she expected. "I'll fix the post today," he said. He did, and the brindle steer tested that section of fence on the second night and found it sound. The weeks that followed established a kind of rhythm that neither of them had planned for, and both of them came to depend on without quite admitting it. Paul rode out to the northern pasture every morning, and more often than not, the most direct route there took him past the main house. He began stopping for coffee. Inez had a cast iron stove in her kitchen that she kept burning from before dawn, and the coffee she made was black and strong and very good. The first morning he stopped, she handed him a tin cup without comment and went back to whatever she had been reading at the kitchen table. The newspaper from San Antonio, a week old by the time it reached Dusty Creek, folded open to the financial pages. "You follow cattle prices?" he asked, surprised. "I follow everything that affects what I can get for my animals," she said. "Don't you?" "I do," he said. "I just didn't expect to find someone out here doing the same." Inez looked up from the paper. "Why, because I'm a woman." He met her gaze steadily. "Because most people in this county don't bother," he said. "Man or woman." She held his gaze for a moment, then went back to the paper. But there was something slightly different in her posture after that, a slight loosening of the careful tension she wore like a second garment. He sat at her kitchen table and drank his coffee, and they talked about beef prices, and whether the railroad extension coming toward Careville would change how they could get their animals to market. And it was the most genuinely useful conversation Paul had had about business in longer than he could immediately remember. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. By the third week, it was simply a thing that happened. He arrived around 6:30, and she had 2 cups already poured. They sat across the table from each other in the early morning quiet, and talked about the land and the animals and the weather, and gradually, about other things. He learned that she had been educated by her mother, who had been a schoolteacher before she married, and that Inez had read extensively and had opinions about most of what she had read. He learned that she had taught herself to shoot by practicing on fence posts for 2 summers because her father had said it was a useful skill for anyone who lived this far from town, and because she had decided if it was a useful skill it was worth being good at, not just adequate. He learned that she had not cried at her brother's funeral because she had been too busy making sure all the practical details were handled correctly, and that she had cried for 3 days afterward, alone on this porch, when there was no longer anything practical left to do. She told him that last thing without planning to tell him. It came out on a morning when the rain was coming down outside and the kitchen felt smaller and closer than usual, and she was not sure afterward how she had let it slip. She looked at him after she said it, braced for something, she was not sure what. Pity perhaps, or discomfort. He said, "That sounds like you. Take care of everything that needs doing first." She exhaled slowly. "Yes," she said, "I suppose it is." "There's nothing wrong with that," Paul said, "and there's nothing wrong with the 3 days either." She looked at her coffee cup. "People around here think there is," she said quietly. "They think I should have been more openly distressed, more in need of help. Instead, I was out fixing a fence the morning of the burial because 3 of the cattle had gotten through in the night, and if I didn't fix it they'd be on Hogg's land by noon and he'd have some legal argument to make about it." "And did you fix the fence?" "I did." "And did the cattle get on Hogg's land?" "They did not." Paul set down his cup. "Then you did what needed doing," he said, "and the people who judge you for it have never had to do it themselves." Inez looked at him across the table with an expression he could not fully read. There was something in it that was not the careful watchfulness she usually wore, something more open and more uncertain at the same time. "You are a strange man, Paul Hunter," she said. "I've been told," he said. "I didn't mean it as an insult." "I know," he said. The spring deepened into summer, and the hill country turned from green to gold as the heat built. The work intensified as it always did in summer. Inez was up before dawn every day, working until the heat of midday became dangerous, resting through the worst of the afternoon, and working again in the cooler hours of early evening. Paul matched her rhythm naturally, working his cattle and maintaining the lease acreage, and showing up at her kitchen table every morning without fail. He had begun helping with things that were not strictly his responsibility. Not in an overbearing way, not the way Randall Hogg had suggested he could help by taking over. He helped the way a neighbor helps a neighbor, noticing what needed doing and lending a hand without making a performance of it. He fixed the weak board on the barn door one afternoon while Inez was in town. He helped her move a section of fence line that would give the cattle better access to the creek water in the dry months. He pulled 3 calves that had troubled births in the night, and was covered in the particular mess of that work by the time Inez arrived at the barn at dawn, and he accepted the clean shirt she handed him through the barn door without embarrassment on either side. The town of Dusty Creek was paying attention. Mrs. Briggs mentioned to Inez, with the careful casualness of someone who is mentioning something very deliberately, that people were talking. That people had noticed how often Paul Hunter's horse was tied up at the Turner gate. That people were drawing conclusions. Inez bought her supplies and looked at Mrs. Briggs and said, "People can draw whatever conclusions they like. We have a business arrangement." "Of course," Mrs. Briggs said, and her tone said something entirely different. Inez drove home in the wagon with Fletcher plodding along the familiar road and told herself the town could mind its own affairs and she could mind hers. She was good at telling herself things. The trouble arrived in July in the form of Randall Hogg, who had not entirely forgiven the hat incident and who had spent several months convincing himself that his wounded pride was actually a legitimate legal grievance. He rode to the Turner ranch on a hot Thursday morning with 2 men she did not recognize. Large and deliberate in the way hired trouble was always deliberate, and he stopped at the gate and called for her to come out. She came out. She came out with the Colt on her hip and her spine exactly straight, and her eyes doing that thing where they were perfectly still and perfectly watchful. "Miss Turner," Randall said, from the comfortable height of his horse. "I've had a look at your property records, and it seems you are significantly behind on the mortgage your father took with the bank." "I am aware of my financial situation," Inez said, "and I am current on my obligations. Your father's bank received a payment in March." "A partial payment," Randall said. "The agreement was for the full quarterly amount. The agreement allows for a payment schedule that was renegotiated when my brother passed. I have the documentation." She kept her voice level. "Is there something you actually want, Randall, or did you ride out here in this heat to tell me things I already know?" He shifted in his saddle. The 2 large men on either side of him were trying to look menacing and mostly succeeding. "I want you to understand that the bank is running out of patience, and that there are interested buyers for this land who would pay a fair price and simplify everyone's situation." "I am not selling," Inez said. "You might not have a choice," Randall said, and something in his tone was not quite a threat but was leaning toward one. Paul's horse came around the corner of the barn at a canter, and Paul pulled up alongside the gate with the naturalness of someone who happened to be arriving at that exact moment, which was true. He had been working in the northern pasture and had seen the riders from a distance and had read the particular shape of the situation from 300 yards away. He tipped his hat to Randall Hogg with polite disinterest. "Morning," he said. Randall looked at him. "Hunter." "Mr. Hogg." Paul rested his hands on his saddle horn in the easy way of a man with nothing to prove and no particular reason to prove it. "I believe Miss Turner told you she's not selling. I also happen to know, since I lease her northern acreage, that the income from that arrangement is sufficient to meet the remaining mortgage payments on schedule. So I am not sure what you've come out here to accomplish, but I suspect it isn't going to work." Randall's jaw tightened. He looked from Paul to Inez and back again, and he made whatever calculation men like Randall Hogg make when they realize the angle they were working has changed shape. "This isn't over," he said. "It is for today," Inez said, and her voice was perfectly pleasant. Randall Hogg turned his horse and rode back down the road, his 2 large companions following, and the dust they raised settled slowly in the hot air. Inez stood at the gate until they were out of sight. Then she turned to Paul with an expression he had not seen before. It was not weakness, it was not gratitude exactly, it was something more complicated. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I was handling it." "You were," he agreed. "I just thought an extra voice might be useful. I should have asked first. I'm sorry if I overstepped." She looked at him for a long moment. The heat pressed down around them, and somewhere in the north pasture one of the cattle called to another, and the sound carried in the still air. "You didn't overstep," she said quietly. "Thank you." It was the first time she had thanked him in a way that meant more than courtesy. That evening, Inez sat on her porch after supper and watched the stars come out, one by one, and then all at once the way they did on clear nights when there was no moon. The sky over the Edwards Plateau was extraordinary in a way she had never entirely gotten used to. An abundance of stars so thick it looked like something spilled across dark cloth, and she had grown up under this sky, and she still sometimes caught her breath at it. She thought about Paul Hunter. She thought about the way he had ridden up alongside the gate without making any fuss about it, without making it about himself, or about what he was doing, or about what she owed him for it. She thought about the way he listened when she talked, fully and without waiting for a pause to say something over her. She thought about how he had said simply that there was nothing wrong with taking care of what needed doing. Nobody had said that to her before, not like he had meant it. She was being careful. She was always careful these days, because she had learned that people in Dusty Creek saw what they expected to see, and what they expected to see when they looked at her and Paul together was something she had not decided what to do with yet. She was not in the habit of wanting things she did not know how to secure. It felt unsafe, like standing on ground you had not tested. Paul, for his part, had his own careful reckoning to make. He lay on the cot in the room above the feed store that night and acknowledged to himself, with the honesty that comes in the dark after the working day is done, that he had ridden to the Turner ranch that morning not because the herd needed checking in the northern pasture, but because some part of him had registered from 300 yards away that the men at her gate were trouble. He had come because he wanted to. He examined this for a while, turning it over like a stone to see what was underneath it. He had not come to Dusty Creek looking for a woman. He had come for land. But he had not, in all his years of looking for land, sat across anyone's kitchen table before dawn and felt that the morning was exactly the right length, or wanted the coffee to last longer than it did. He had not been a man given to easy feelings. His life had been practical and physical, full of work and movement and not much stillness. Inez Turner was the first person in a long time who made stillness feel like something worth having rather than something to fill. She was fierce. She was unapologetically and completely fierce, and it was the thing about her that everyone in Dusty Creek seemed to think was a problem, and that Paul found himself thinking about the way you think about something that is simply exactly right. Fierce was what you needed out here. The land was hard and the work was hard, and the years could be very long, and what you needed beside you was not something soft and decorative but something real. He was going to need to think carefully about what he did with this. August arrived and brought with it a dry spell that the old-timers said was the worst in 6 years. The creeks dropped and the grass went yellow sooner than it should have, and everyone with cattle was calculating water and deciding which animals to sell early and which to hold. Inez and Paul found themselves in daily consultation about the shared water resources on the property, and those consultations became the primary excuse, for a while, to see each other. One afternoon they rode out together to check the spring that fed the eastern creek, the main water source for both herds, and found the flow reduced to about half what it had been in May. They stood on the bank of the creek together and looked at the water and both did the same mental arithmetic. "We'll need to rotate them more carefully," Inez said. "Keep my herd in the southern pasture through the week and move yours to the northern on alternating days. The spring will recover between uses." "That works," Paul said. "I can move a trough to the boundary line for the days when one group is held further out." "That would help." They stood there a moment longer, the afternoon light falling slant through the cedar branches above the creek, the water making its quiet sound over the limestone bedrock. A painted bunting, impossibly bright in its red and blue and green, landed on a branch across the water and considered them briefly before departing. "I've been thinking," Paul said. Inez waited. He had been organizing this in his mind for several days, trying to find the right words for something that felt important to get right. "I've been thinking about making this arrangement more permanent," he said. "The land, I mean, the business arrangement. I'd like to offer to buy into the property rather than lease. It would mean you have the capital to clear the mortgage entirely, and I would have a stake in land I've been working. We would be equal partners." Inez was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the creek. "Equal partners," she said. 50-50, Paul said. "On paper, legally enforceable. Nothing that depends on trust alone, though I would hope that was there too." She turned to look at him. "That is a significant offer," she said carefully. "It's a significant piece of land," he said, "and I think we work well together." Inez studied his face for a long, unhurried moment. Whatever she was looking for in it, she seemed to find something, because her expression shifted in a way he was learning to read. "I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it for 4 days, during which she also talked to Mrs. Briggs, not for advice exactly, but to hear herself talking, which sometimes helped her sort out what she actually believed. Mrs. Briggs listened and then said shrewdly, "You know, Inez, being a business partner and being a fool about a man are different things. You've always been sensible enough to tell the difference." "People will talk," Inez said. "People always talk," Mrs. Briggs said. "The question is whether what they're talking about is something you actually want." Inez drove home and thought about it some more. On the 5th day, she rode to the northern pasture where Paul was working on a section of fence line, patching a gap that one of his steers had widened. She pulled her horse up next to where he was working and waited until he had set down his tools and turned to look at her. "I'll take the partnership offer," she said. "I have 3 conditions." "Tell me," he said. "The paperwork is done properly with a land agent and a lawyer present, not just a gentleman's agreement." "Agreed, that was my intention. The split is 50-50 on all decisions, not just financial ones. Either of us can say no to something that affects the land." "Agreed. And if this stops working for any reason, there's a buyout clause that's fair to both parties and written into the contract." He looked at her steadily. "You've thought about this carefully." "I think about everything carefully," she said. "I know," he said. "That was my 3rd condition too. That we both go in with clear eyes." She held his gaze. There it was again, that thing between them that was not yet named but had been accumulating for weeks, patient and persistent as water working its way through stone. "Then we're agreed," she said. "We're agreed," he said. She turned her horse to go, then stopped. She looked back over her shoulder with an expression that was, for her, remarkably unguarded. "I'm glad you came to Dusty Creek, Paul Hunter," she said. Then she rode away before either of them had to decide what to do with that. The partnership paperwork was completed in September, in the office of a lawyer named Mr. Ephraim Calloway, who had enough experience with land deals in Kerr County to do it correctly without fuss. Randall Hogg learned about it within a week because small towns are like that, and he came to the bank to speak with his father about it, and his father told him that the Turner mortgage would be paid in full at the end of the month, and there was nothing further to be done about it. Randall was not graceful about this, but he was at least quiet. The autumn settled over the hill country in the particular way it did, which was gently and slowly, the heat easing back degree by degree until one morning you woke up and the air was cool, and the light was lower and thinner, and the whole world smelled different, like cedar resin and dry grass and the approach of something new. Inez and Paul worked through the fall roundup together, cutting out the cattle to sell, negotiating with the cattle buyer who came down from Kerrville, loading the animals onto the livestock wagons. Deke Salter worked alongside them, and Inez found that she liked the old man, who said little but noticed everything, and treated her with the unconscious respect of someone who judged people by their horsemanship and their early mornings and nothing else. One evening in October, when the work was mostly done, and the proceeds from the sale were counted, and the numbers were better than they had been in years, Inez cooked supper for both of them at the main house. It was not a remarkable occasion in itself. She had fed Paul at her table before, working meals, functional and efficient. But this evening she made an effort she did not entirely explain to herself. She took the good dishes from the shelf. She made a proper roast with the vegetables she had grown in the kitchen garden and cornbread, and dried apple pie that took most of the afternoon to get right. Paul arrived for supper, and she watched him notice the table, set properly with the good dishes, and she watched him look at her, and then away again without making a comment about it, which was exactly right. They ate and talked, and the evening stretched comfortably, the way evenings do when you are with someone you have stopped feeling the need to perform for. The lamp burned low on the table between them, and outside the window the first real chill of autumn was in the air, and there was a tremendous quantity of stars. "Can I ask you something?" Paul said. "You usually just ask," Inez said. "You don't usually ask if you can ask." "This is a different kind of question," he said. She put down her coffee cup and gave him her full attention. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man who has prepared words and is now deciding whether the prepared words are actually the right ones. Then he seemed to set them aside entirely. "I think you know how I feel about you," he said. She kept her eyes on him. "And I think you know because you're the most observant person I have ever met in my life, and I am not subtle enough to have hidden it from you for very long," he continued, and there was a thread of wry self-awareness in his voice that she found she wanted badly to smile at. "I want to say it plainly, not because you need me to, but because I need to. I have not wanted to be in the same place as another person the way I want to be in the same place as you. That's all." The lamp flickered. The kitchen was very quiet. "I have been called too fierce to be any man's wife," Inez said. She said it carefully, the way you handle something you have turned over many times in the dark. "The women here think so. The men who thought they wanted to court me changed their minds when they realized what fierce actually meant, which is that I won't be quiet about things that matter, and I won't pretend to need help I don't need, and I won't become smaller to fit a space someone else decided I should occupy." "I know," Paul said. "I'm not going to change those things," she said. "I know that too," he said. "Inez, fierce is exactly what I need." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight, and she understood, with the clarity she usually reserved for problems that had a correct solution, that this was also a problem with a correct solution. She had been standing outside the answer for months, turning it over, checking the angles, looking for the flaw in it. There was no flaw. "I think," she said slowly, "that you had better tell me the rest of what you mean to say." Paul reached across the table and put his hand over hers where it rested on the tablecloth, and she looked down at his hand and felt something she had been holding tightly in her chest, without knowing she was holding it, loosen. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "With your permission, and with the understanding that there is no agenda behind it other than the honest one." Inez turned her hand over beneath his and looked at him squarely. "You may court me," she said, "but I reserve the right to change my mind about anything that isn't working." "That's fair," he said, "and I want it understood that my name stays on this land regardless of what happens between us personally." "It was always going to stay on this land," he said. "That was never a question," she exhaled. There it was, the simplicity of it, which she had somehow expected to be complicated. "Then we understand each other," she said. "We always have," he said. The autumn deepened into winter, and the courtship of Inez Turner and Paul Hunter took place with a directness and a thoroughness that was very much in the character of both of them. He rode with her on Sundays when the work allowed, not to church, because Inez had a complicated relationship with the Dusty Creek congregation that neither of them felt needed to be more complicated by gossip, but out into the land itself, following the ridgeline to where you could see for 50 miles on a clear day, and the whole country lay spread out in the winter light like something offered. He told her about his childhood in New Mexico territory, about his father who had been a fair and hard-working man, about his mother who had died when he was 12 and left a particular kind of absence he had never entirely filled. He told her about the cattle drives, about the men he had worked with and respected, about the country he had seen and the country he had loved best, which had always been Texas, the high ground of it, the hard, beautiful, specific ground of this particular place. She told him about her mother's books, which still lined 2 shelves in the front room of the house, and about the year she had spent at 15 reading everything on those shelves, because a bad winter had kept them all indoors and she had run out of other things to do. She told him about Marcus, her brother, who had been gentle and funny and completely terrible at mending fence, and who had been her best friend for her whole life, and talking about him was still something she did carefully, like carrying water that might spill. Paul listened. He was very good at listening. They rode back from the ridgeline one December afternoon as the light was going gold and the air had the cold clarity of a dry winter day, and Paul said, out of the particular quiet that had settled between them, "I keep thinking about what this place could be. 5 years from now, 10. Tell me," Inez said. "Better breeding stock." "I've been reading about what some of the ranches up in Williamson County are doing with Hereford crossbreeds. Better return on the animals you sell. And the northern pasture, if we redirected the creek flow slightly, just a small earthwork, we could open up another 100 acres of reliable grazing." "I've thought about the creek redirection," Inez said. "I was afraid it would affect the spring output." "It might minimally. I think the output would recover in a season." "I'd want to test it on a small scale first," she said. "That's sensible." They rode in easy silence for a moment, their horses walking close together on the narrow track. "We think about the same things," Inez said, not as a question. "We do," Paul said. She looked over at him as they rode, his profile against the winter sky, relaxed and familiar in a way that had sneaked up on her so gradually she had not noticed it happening until it was simply true. "Paul," she said. He looked at her. "I love this land," she said. "I love it the way you love something that cost you something. My father built this place and my brother and I kept it, and it has cost me a great deal, and I love it because of what it cost, not in spite of it." "I know," he said. "I am telling you because I want you to understand that when I say I want you here," she took a breath, "I mean something specific by it. I mean the same kind of thing. Something I mean because it has weight." Paul pulled his horse to a stop and she stopped hers beside him, and he looked at her in the winter afternoon light with that gray gaze that she had decided some time ago was her favorite color. "Inez Turner," he said quietly, "are you telling me you love me?" "I am telling you," she said carefully, "that what I feel for you has weight. That is what I am telling you," he smiled. It was a slow smile that changed his whole face, and she felt it in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward. "I'll take it," he said. They were married on a Saturday in February of 1883, in the main room of the Turner Ranch house, because Inez was not interested in being married in the Dusty Creek Church under the collective scrutiny of a congregation that had spent years making up its mind about her, and because Paul's preference was for something real and specific rather than something performed. They were married by the circuit preacher who came through the county every 6 weeks, a straightforward man named Reverend Aldis who asked them their vows and received their answers and shook their hands afterward with evident satisfaction. Mrs. Briggs was there, beaming. Deke Salter stood in the back of the room with his hat in his hands and his good shirt on, which was the most formal anyone had ever seen him be. A woman named Clara Whitfield, who ran the telegraph office and was the closest thing Inez had to a genuine friend in Dusty Creek, stood beside her and handed her a small bunch of winter wildflowers she had found God only knew where in February. After Reverend Aldis said the words that needed saying, and they exchanged the plain silver rings Paul had ordered from the jeweler in San Antonio 2 months before, Inez stood in her own front room as a married woman for the first time in her life, and discovered that she did not feel any different than she had before, except that she was holding Paul Hunter's hand, and it seemed like the most natural thing she had ever done. The reception was a supper at the ranch house to which a total of 11 people came, and it was the best party that had ever taken place on the Turner property, which was now the Hunter-Turner property, because Inez had been clear about that and Paul had not needed convincing. She wore a blue dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from San Antonio, not a wedding dress exactly, but a good dress, a dress that meant something. Her hair was down, which was rare enough that when she came into the room in it, Mrs. Briggs put a hand over her heart. Paul, when he saw her, simply stopped moving for a moment. Then he walked to her and took her hands and said very quietly so only she could hear it, "You are remarkable." She felt herself color, which was a new experience. "Don't say things like that," she told him. "I'm going to keep saying it," he said. "You should probably get used to it." She decided she could do that. The spring that followed their marriage was the best they had seen on the land in years. The rains came in good order, the creek ran full and clear, and the grass in all the pastures came in thick and early. The cattle were in excellent condition and the calf crop was strong. They implemented Paul's idea about the creek redirection on a small test scale, and it worked exactly as he had projected, opening additional grazing and recovering its flow within 2 months. They worked the land together with the same rhythm they had established before the marriage, side by side in the mornings and evenings, their conversation moving fluidly between the practical and the personal. Inez had not known before this that it was possible for life to feel both more full and more like herself simultaneously. She had expected marriage to require some subtraction of who she was. It had required nothing of the sort. What she had not expected was how much she enjoyed having someone to talk to after dark, when the work was done and the house was quiet. Paul read, like she did, and they had fallen into the habit of reading in the same room in the evenings, sometimes talking about what they were reading, sometimes simply sitting in the comfortable parallel quiet of two people who are at ease with each other's presence. She had not known that silence could be a thing you shared rather than a thing you endured alone. She also had not anticipated the way the physical presence of another person, the warmth of someone sleeping beside you in the cold of a February night, the simple fact of not waking up alone in a house that had been very quiet for a very long time, would register in her body as something close to relief. She had been stronger than she needed to be, she thought now, for a very long time. Not because strength was wrong, but because she had had no one with whom to put it down occasionally and simply be. Paul gave her that. She was not sure she had the words for what she felt about it that did not sound like more than she was comfortable admitting out loud. So she showed it in the small daily ways that he was learning to read. The coffee that was already poured when he came in before dawn. The way she rode out to meet him at the gate in the evenings. The way she argued with him openly and thoroughly about ranch decisions, because she trusted him completely, and trusted people you trust differently than you trust anyone else. Summer came hot and demanding as it always did, and they worked through it. And in the summer, Deke Salter announced that he was thinking about his sister's place in New Mexico and maybe heading that direction before he got any older. Paul thanked him with genuine warmth and genuine regret, and Deke shook his hand and tipped his hat to Inez and said, with the economy of an old man who had seen a great deal, "You two are going to be all right." "I know," Inez said. They hired 2 hands to replace Deke's work, brothers named Alfredo and Miguel Reyes who had come up from South Texas, and who were excellent cowboys with the cattle, and who were treated on the Hunter Turner ranch exactly as what they were, which was skilled men doing skilled work for fair wages. Inez had always understood that the work of running a ranch in Texas was impossible without the labor of men and women who were frequently poorly treated by the ranches that needed them most, and she refused to contribute to it. She paid fairly and expected the same standard of work from everyone, including herself. Alfredo and Miguel stayed for years. They became fixtures of the place, as integral to the land as the spring-fed creek and the brindle steer who was still, 3 years later, testing fence lines. In the fall of 1883, Inez told Paul one morning over coffee that she was pregnant. She said it the way she said most things, directly and without excessive ceremony, but her hands around the coffee cup were very still in a way that told him she was feeling something larger than she was showing. He put down his own cup and reached across the table and took both her hands in both of his, and he held them for a moment without speaking. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "I am just thinking about what it means." "Tell me," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I am thinking that I do not know how to be a mother," she said. "I know how to run a ranch and manage cattle and handle a negotiation and fix a fence. I do not know how to be someone's mother." "You'll learn," Paul said, "the same way you learned everything else." "What if I'm too fierce?" she said, and it came out with a self-awareness that was also a kind of humor, and he loved her tremendously for it. "Then you'll raise a fierce child," Paul said. "And I can't think of anything better." She looked at him, and her eyes were brighter than usual, which for Inez Turner was the equivalent of tears for anyone else. "You really aren't frightened by any of it, are you?" she said. "I'm frightened plenty," he said honestly. "I'm just not frightened in a way that makes me want to run from it." Their son was born in May of 1884, in the early morning when the light was coming up pale gold through the bedroom window, and the hill country outside was just beginning to make the sounds it made when the day was starting. He was a big, healthy baby who announced his arrival with considerable volume, and who had Paul's dark hair and Inez's watchful gray-green eyes. They named him Thomas Marcus Hunter, for both the men they had lost. Inez held him in the quiet after the midwife had tidied everything and Paul had come in and sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and she looked down at this small, furious new person, and she felt something she did not have a word for. It was not soft exactly. It was tremendous. It was the same feeling she had about the land, she thought, the feeling of something that cost you something, and that you loved because of what it cost. She understood now that she had more capacity for that feeling than she had known. "Hello, Thomas Marcus," she said quietly. "This is your land. I'll teach you everything about it." Paul put his arm around her shoulders gently, and she leaned into him in the way she had learned to lean, the way that required nothing of her to give up. The years on the Hunter Turner ranch were good years and hard years and full years. The cattle enterprise grew steadily, not extravagantly but solidly, the way things grow when they are tended well. The Hereford crossbreeding program Paul had proposed proved out, and their animals consistently brought better prices at market. The creek redirection expanded in 3 stages and opened the full additional 100 acres Paul had originally envisioned. The mortgage had been cleared in 1883, and the land was fully theirs, free and clear. And Inez took a particular satisfaction in that fact that she expressed, typically, by saying nothing about it and simply working a little harder. Randall Hogg married a woman from San Antonio and moved there, and was not significantly missed by the community of Dusty Creek, which carried on as small towns do, absorbing its changes and exporting its gossip, and making up its collective mind about things on a 6-week delay. The collective mind of Dusty Creek eventually made its peace with Inez Turner Hunter, partly because people are generally capable of adjusting their assessments when presented with evidence over time, and partly because she was too permanently present and too demonstrably competent to sustain indefinite resentment against. The women who had removed her from the list of acceptable brides saw, over time, a marriage that looked more solid than most of what the acceptable brides had managed, and some of them, quietly, revised their understanding of what acceptable meant. Mrs. Briggs, for her part, took complete credit for the marriage, because she had been the one to send Paul Hunter out the East Road to the Turner Ranch on that April afternoon in 1882, and she told the story of it with relish and embellishment whenever anyone gave her an opening. Thomas was 4 years old when his sister arrived. They named her Catherine Ruth, for no one who had been lost, but for the names they simply liked, which felt like a different kind of choice. She came into the world with Inez's ferocity immediately apparent in the volume of her initial objections to being cold and exposed to the outside air, and Paul held her against his chest in the first minutes and felt something in himself rearrange permanently. The way things rearrange when they find the shape they were always supposed to be in. Thomas was skeptical of his sister for approximately 3 weeks and devoted to her for the rest of his childhood, which was a pattern that anyone familiar with 4-year-olds and new siblings would have predicted. Inez nursed Catherine and managed the ranch accounts and argued cheerfully with Paul about the optimal timing for the fall roundup. And she did all of these things simultaneously, with the comprehensive capability that had always defined her, and that she had stopped apologizing for some time ago, if she had ever really started. Paul watched her one evening, from across the front room where she sat at the table doing the ranch ledgers, while Catherine slept in the cradle nearby, and Thomas's voice could be heard from the yard, where he was doing something complicated with a stick and a fence post that seemed to make complete sense to him. And Paul felt the particular fullness of a life that has become exactly what you needed it to be. He had come to Dusty Creek looking for land. He had found land and also the person who knew it best and loved it hardest, and who had let him in to love it alongside her, which was something he understood now had been a considerable gift. Inez looked up from the ledger and caught him watching her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She put down her pen. "Paul Hunter, you have a look on your face that means something." "I was thinking that I'm glad I came to Dusty Creek," he said. She looked at him steadily across the lamplit room, with the cradle beside her and the sound of Thomas outside and the ranch ledger open on the table showing numbers that were healthy and growing. "You rode up to my gate," she said, "and you got off your horse when I told you to, and you sat in that chair on the porch, and you talked to me like I was a person worth talking to." "You are," he said. "I know that," she said, and her voice was dry but her eyes were something else entirely. "But you are the first person who arrived at my gate knowing nothing about me who also knew that." He stood up from his chair and crossed the room to where she sat and crouched down beside her chair so they were at the same level, and he took her hand. "I have to say something," he said. "Say it," she said. "I was told you were fierce," he said. "I heard it before I ever met you. And I came out here anyway, and I sat on your porch, and I talked to you, and I thought, yes, that is exactly what I need." Inez looked at him, his face close to hers in the warm light, the face she knew now in all its variations, at work and at rest and in the dark and in the early morning and in the long evenings, the face she had been watching for 2.5 years with the full attention she gave to everything that mattered to her. "Fierce is what you needed," she said. "Fierce is exactly what I needed," he said. "And everything else about you besides." From outside, Thomas's voice called something about the stick and the fence post that seemed to be reaching a critical juncture. Catherine stirred in her cradle and made the small sounds that meant she would need attention in the next few minutes. The lamp burned steadily between them. Inez brought his hand up and pressed her lips to the back of it, briefly, in the quick, unsentimental way that was hers, and then she stood and went to the cradle and lifted Catherine, who settled against her shoulder with the comfortable weight of a baby who knows exactly where she is supposed to be. Paul went outside to see what Thomas was building. The moon was coming up over the eastern ridge, big and amber in the October sky, and the cattle in the pasture were settling for the night, their shapes dark and quiet against the grass. The air was cool and carried the smell of cedar and dry grass and the coming winter, and in the house behind him the lamp was burning, and through the window he could see Inez moving with Catherine at her shoulder, her braid down her back, talking to the baby in a voice too low to carry through the glass but visible in the movement of her mouth. Thomas had built something from the stick that he explained at considerable length, and that Paul followed approximately half of, and he crouched down in the dry grass beside his son and listened carefully to the whole explanation and asked good questions. The stars were coming out, one by one and then all at once, the same extravagance of stars that had hung over this land for longer than anyone had been there to see them, and they would hang over it for longer still. In 1887, the ranch turned its best profit in its history. They expanded the herd to 140 animals. Inez negotiated directly with the rail agent in Kerrville for a better transport rate, which she got, because she had spent 4 years learning exactly what leverage she had and how to use it, and the rail agent, unlike the cattle buyer in the early days, had made the error of underestimating her only once. Paul had begun to be known in the county as someone to talk to about cattle management and breeding programs, and he was occasionally asked to consult for neighboring ranches, which he did when the timing allowed. He was careful always to note that most of what he knew about the country itself, the water and the soil and the particular rhythms of the land in this part of Texas, he had learned from his wife. He said this matter-of-factly because it was true, and he noticed that it made certain men in the county uncomfortable, and that this discomfort was their problem entirely. Thomas, at 6, had begun following both of them at their work with the concentrated curiosity of a child who intends to understand everything. He was quiet and observant like his mother and unhurried like his father, and he was going to be remarkable. They both thought independently and told each other separately, and smiled at the recognition that they were thinking the same thing. Catherine, at 2, was conducting a prolonged negotiation with the world about what she would and would not tolerate, and her tolerance threshold was significantly lower than anyone else's in the household, and she was entirely correct about what she wanted most of the time, which made it hard to argue with her even when what she wanted was inconvenient. On a winter evening in December of 1887, Paul and Inez sat on the porch after supper with their coats on, as they did sometimes, watching the stars in the cold, clear air. Thomas was asleep. Catherine was asleep. The ranch was quiet. "I want to tell you something," Inez said. "Tell me," he said. "I have been thinking about what I was before you came here," she said. "Not unhappy. I want to be clear about that. I was not waiting to be happy. I was not half a person waiting to be completed. I was managing." "I know," he said. "I managed very well," she said. "You did. But I was also lonely," she said. "I had not admitted that to myself. I was too busy managing to be lonely, and I had decided that being lonely was something other people were, people who were not busy enough. And I was wrong about that." Paul was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "I was lonely too," he said, "on the road, moving from place to place. I thought that was just what it was, that some people lived that way and it was fine. And then I sat at your kitchen table before dawn and talked about beef prices," he said, "and I drove back to that room above the feed store and I thought, I want to do that again tomorrow, and the day after that." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Beef prices," she said. "You were talking about them like they were the most interesting thing in the world," he said. "And the way you talked about them made them the most interesting thing in the world." She looked at him in the cold starlight, this man who had ridden up her road on a red roan horse in the spring of 1882 and gotten off his horse when she told him to and sat in her porch chair and talked to her as if her words had the same weight as anyone else's and more weight than most. "I love you," she said. She said it directly and without decoration, the way she said everything that mattered. "I love you," he said, equally directly, equally plainly, which was one of the reasons she trusted it. They sat on the porch in the cold until the chill drove them inside, and then they came into the warm house where the stove was banked for the night, and the lamp was low and the children were sleeping, and the house was full of the kind of quiet that is different from loneliness because it is shared. The years did what years do. They brought work and weather and the small accumulating events that make up a life. They brought the telegraph line extended to Dusty Creek in 1885, which changed things. They brought the railroad to Careville in 1887, which changed things more significantly, and for the better for anyone selling cattle. They brought the terrible drought of 1886, which every rancher in the county felt hard, and which the Hunter-Turner Ranch survived, because they had spent 4 years building their water management correctly, and the spring-fed creek held where other ranches went dry. They brought a second son in 1889, a boy they named James Paul, who came out with Inez's dark hair and Paul's gray eyes, and who screamed with such authority from his first breath that Inez laughed, genuinely and fully, in the middle of the entirely undignified process of childbirth, which startled the midwife considerably. "What?" the midwife said. "He is going to be absolutely impossible," Inez said, looking at her youngest son with enormous fondness. Paul, who had been present for all 3 births in a way that was unusual for the time because Inez had told him plainly that she wanted him there, and he had not required more reason than that, took his son and held him and said, "Hello, James. We are very glad you're here." James Paul Hunter lived up to his initial announcement in every subsequent year, being the most thoroughly determined small person any of them had encountered, which, given that his mother was Inez Turner Hunter and his grandmother on his father's side had apparently been similarly relentless, suggested some things about inheritance that were interesting to consider. By 1890, the Hunter-Turner Ranch was 160 acres larger than it had been in 1882, the additional land having been purchased from a neighbor who had decided to move to the city, and the herd was among the better managed in the county. Thomas was 12 and had begun to learn the books alongside his mother with a seriousness that was entirely his own. Catherine was 8 and had inherited her mother's marksmanship along with her mother's opinion of people who told her what she ought to want, which was developing into a most impressive self-determination. James was 2 and was currently in the middle of a passionate relationship with the chickens, whom he visited daily with the enthusiasm of someone paying court. The cattle buyer from Careville, the one who had spent years trying to underprice Inez on her animals, had retired. His replacement was a younger man who had been told about Inez Turner Hunter's negotiating abilities and came to the table accordingly. It was a distinct improvement. Mrs. Briggs retired from the general store in 1890 and turned it over to her nephew, and the town of Dusty Creek came out in force to mark the occasion with a supper and speeches. Inez was there with Paul, and Mrs. Briggs, seeing them come in together, took Inez's hand and held it for a moment and said privately, "I knew," and Inez said with great dignity, "You sent a complete stranger to my property based on a conversation of 10 minutes, and Mrs. Briggs said, "And I was right," and Inez said, "You were right," because she was not a person who failed to acknowledge correct information when she encountered it. The land in the spring of 1891 was everything it had always been and more, the grass coming in thick and early on the expanded acreage, the creek running clear and full over the limestone bedrock, the cattle moving through the pastures in the way that cattle move when the land is managed well, and the animals are healthy, and the people who tend them know what they are doing. Inez rode the fence line on a March morning when the bluebonnets were coming in along the creek bank, and the sky was the precise clean blue that only existed in Texas in early spring, and she rode Fletcher's successor, a gray mare named Louise who had been a gift from Paul on their 5th anniversary, and who was the finest horse on the property. She rode the line from the southern boundary to the northern and checked each post and each wire, and noted the one section on the east side that would need attention before summer, and she rode back toward the house in the morning light with the whole of the property around her, the property her father had built and her brother had held, and she had kept through difficult years and grown through good ones. She pulled Louise to the top of the low ridge that gave the best view of the main house, and she sat a moment looking at it. The smoke rising from the kitchen stovepipe, meaning Paul was up and the coffee was on. Thomas's horse already saddled at the post, meaning he was up early as he usually was. The chickens visible in their yard, which meant James was not yet awake because when James was awake the chickens were in motion and you could always tell. She had been told for years that she was too much, too fierce, too direct, too capable, too independent. She had been told these things as if they were problems to be corrected rather than qualities to be respected. She had carried those assessments for a long time, turning them over, trying to see herself through the town's eyes and understand what she was supposed to do about it. She had found in the end that what she was supposed to do about it was exactly nothing. Paul came out of the house while she was sitting on the ridge, carrying 2 cups of coffee, which meant he had seen her from the kitchen window and known she was sitting up there, and known she might want coffee. He walked up the slope with the easy gait of a man who had spent 9 years walking this specific ground, and he handed her a cup and stood beside Louise and squinted out at the land in the morning light. "Good morning to the fence line," he asked. "East side needs work before June," she said, "otherwise sound." I'll get Alfredo on it this week." She sipped the coffee. It was very good. It was always very good because Paul made coffee the way he did everything, with full attention. "I was thinking," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I was thinking about the first morning you came to my kitchen table," she said. "You sat down and I gave you a cup and you asked about beef prices and we talked for an hour and I thought afterward, this man is going to be a problem." Paul laughed, the genuine unguarded laugh she had heard for the first time on that April day in 1882 and that she was still, 9 years later, unreasonably fond of. "A problem," he said. "A problem," she confirmed. "Because you were sensible and you listened and you didn't try to tell me anything I already knew. And I thought, if he keeps coming back, this is going to be considerably more complicated than a land lease." "Was I right to keep coming back?" he said. She looked down at him from the mare's back, the hill country morning all around them, the house sending its smoke into the clear air below, and she thought about loneliness and about management, and about what it meant to find the person who made your particular kind of fierce feel like an asset rather than a liability. "Yes," she said simply. He took her hand where it rested on the saddle and held it for a moment. "I love this life," he said. "I love this life," she said. Louise shifted her weight beneath Inez, turning slightly east where the bluebonnets were running blue along the creek bank in the morning light, and the whole of the spring country lay before them, specific and known, and entirely their own. That afternoon, when the morning's work was done and the heat of the midday was building, Inez came into the kitchen and found Thomas at the table with the ranch ledger, working through the numbers with the same careful attention she had always brought to them. He was 12 and he had her eyes and his grandfather's name, and he was going to be exactly fine, she thought. He had grown up on good ground. He knew what the land was worth and what work cost and how to read the weather from the shape of the clouds over the southern ridge. He looked up when she came in. "The Careville buyer sent word about fall pricing," he said. "It's better than last year." "I saw," she said. "What do you think we should do?" He considered the ledger seriously, the way she had always considered it. "Hold 20 more animals through winter and sell in the spring when prices are typically higher," he said. "But only if we're confident the winter grazing will hold. And if it won't, then we sell the extra 20 in October and take the current price," he said. "That's correct," she said, and sat down across from him and looked at the numbers with him, mother and son, going through the careful arithmetic of the land. Paul came in from the barn with James on his shoulders, the boy holding onto his father's hair with both hands and making some kind of declaration about the chickens that he considered very important. And he ducked them both through the kitchen doorway and set James down on the floor where the boy immediately went about his business with the purposeful efficiency of a 2-year-old who has decided on an objective. Catherine came in from outside with mud on her boots and her braid coming undone, and a small painted turtle she had found by the creek, which she introduced to the household with the confidence of someone presenting something obviously welcome. "Where does it live while you figure out what to do with it?" Inez asked. "Outside," Paul said, at the same moment. Catherine looked at her turtle and then at her parents and made the assessment of a child who knows when the arithmetic is against her. "Outside," she agreed. The kitchen filled with the noise and motion of a family in the middle of a working day, and Inez sat at the table with the ledger and the coffee and the sound of all of it, and she felt the tremendous specific weight of it, the same weight she felt about the land. "The cost of things you love," she had told Paul once, "is what makes you love them." She had paid for this life in loss and loneliness and hard winters, and years of being told she was the wrong kind of woman. She loved it because of what it had cost her, and because of what it had become, and because, across the kitchen table, Paul Hunter was untangling himself from a 2-year-old who had decided his boot was interesting, and he was laughing at something Thomas had said, and the afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window at the angle that made everything inside it look exactly right. She had not changed what she was to get this life. She had simply waited until the person arrived who understood that what she was had always been exactly the right thing. Fierce was exactly what he had needed, and everything else about her besides. The bluebonnets bloomed every spring along the creek bank for many years after that, and the spring-fed creek ran clear over its limestone bed. And the grass on the Hunter Turner ranch came in thick and early because the land had been well tended, and the cattle moved through the pastures in the particular unhurried way of animals who are where they are supposed to be. And Thomas and Catherine and James grew up on the good ground their parents had made for them and knew, each in their own way, what the land was worth because their mother had made sure of it. And Inez Turner Hunter rode the fence line every spring morning when the bluebonnets were up, on a good horse in the clean March light, and came back to a kitchen where the coffee was already made, and sat down across the table from the man who had gotten off his horse at her gate and sat in her porch chair, and listened to her the way she deserved to be listened to. This was the whole of it. This was everything. This was exactly, precisely, what Fierce was for.